This is Echo Zoe Radio, episode 162 for October 2021, My Testimony.
Welcome to Echo Zoe Radio, the podcast outreach of Echo Zoe Ministries, where you'll hear about important topics affecting the church today. Our primary goal is to explore a variety of issues while remaining faithful to God and His Word. Stay with us for the next hour as your host, Andy Olson, shares his conversation with this month's guest. Here's your host, Andy Olson.
I'm Andy Olson. Thanks for listening to Echo Zoe Radio. This is episode 162 for October 2021. In a divergence from my normal format, there's no guest this month. It's just me. I've had an interesting few weeks, including catching the Rona and getting over it, mostly. Actually, wasn't too bad for me. My symptoms were quite mild, and aside from some lasting fatigue that flared up my normal fatigue issues, the other symptoms were also pretty short lasting. So I wouldn't have even assumed that I got it if not for, I went to a conference on a Saturday and there was a friend there, lives close to me. We were on the other side of town, but I asked him if he'd like a ride and he rode with me. And that was Saturday. And the following Thursday I got symptoms and started thinking, oh, I wonder if this is it. Am I finally getting the Rona? Or, we thought maybe we'd actually even had it already. But Thursday I started getting symptoms, thought, well, maybe I got a mild cold. He texted me on Friday morning and said that he was positive, and a couple other people that were at the conference also had tested positive. So it was pretty clear that that's what I had. So even though I'm pretty sure I'm over it, I've been over it for over a week and a half. I'm trying to be cautious. And as I said, I had my normal fatigue issues were flared up by it and dealing with excessive fatigue again because of it. It's my one real symptom that has lasted from it. And because of that, I didn't really want to start, brushing up against the end of the month. I didn't want to seek out a guest and then have trouble actually following through with a guest and cause somebody else some scheduling headaches and whatnot. So I thought, I'll try to find something else to do. I didn't want to do a replay episode, which I've only done once that I can remember, but I don't like doing replays, so I didn't want to do that. And got to thinking about it. And I thought, I've kind of sprinkled my testimony a little bit over the 13 years that I've been doing the show, and I've sprinkled it in here and there throughout a bunch of different episodes. But I thought, why not? I'll just do my testimony, and we'll talk about my own backstory and maybe a little bit more actually about your host, about who I am and where I came from and how I got saved. So that's going to be the topic today. So it's just going to be me. I'm going to talk about my testimony, my history growing up, who I am, kind of backstories and stuff. So very much more of a lighthearted, little easygoing episode. And actually, I already got show notes more or less written up because thought the least I could do is plan ahead and try to not ramble too much. But that's what we've got today. So we're going to talk about my testimony. Before I get started, I want to talk a little bit. I brought up last month about locals, and I talked a little bit about trying to get on locals and starting a locals page, and really trying to break out and do something on locals. I'd like to anyway. So I want to talk a little bit more about locals before we get started. First and foremost, because locals is a social media type site, I want to mention that in the past few days, I am done with Facebook. I have went in just a couple days ago. I'm recording on Thursday, the 21st. And a couple days ago, I reactivated my Facebook account, my personal Facebook account, so that I could go into the Echo Zoe Ministries page and outright delete the page. So Echo Zoe Ministries is now off of Facebook. We're not there anymore. And my personal page, which has been deactivated for over 2 years, is now gone. So I am not on Facebook anymore. Just kind of had it with Facebook. The company is, I think they're really very, very unethical. I don't like them as a company at all. I don't want anything to do with them. So I am off Facebook. And not telling anybody else to get off. If you are on Facebook and you're making a ministry of it, or even if you're not, you're just on there with your friends, whatever. This is my thing. I'm not comfortable with it anymore, but to each his own. So I'm off Facebook and trying to, like I said, I want to get something going on locals. And just to be sure that you are kind of locals, it sounds weird. I mean, what is he saying? LOCALS, locals.com. And I just want to encourage you, there is a bit of a mental hurdle involved with the site. I've been a user of locals as a subscriber, kind of, somebody who just, not on the creator side, but on the user side. I've been on there for quite a while, like several months at the very least. But there was a mental hurdle that I had to get over in order to get to that point. And the big thing is because it's a paid subscription service. And it's just, why would you do that? We've been so trained in our mindset, especially with Facebook and whatnot, that these are free sites. Why would I pay for something like that over when I can do it for free over on, say, Facebook or whatnot? And I just want to encourage people to check it out, and not necessarily the Echo Zoe locals page, just locals in general. Check it out. It's a really neat site. It's a great platform. I mean, it's growing like gangbusters, and it's really cool. There's a lot of great people and pages already on there. And I just want to encourage people just to try it. Just check it out. Get your toes wet. I'm not telling you need to pay for anything. Not encouraging people necessarily to pay. Just to check it out, just to see, just create an account. It still is early enough that you can, for a large part, you can get the usernames that you want. My name is common. And Andy is a common first name, and I'm from Minnesota, upper Midwest. Olsons are a dime a dozen here. It's like Smith up here. Olson, Johnson, Anderson. I mean, we're some of the three biggest names in the upper Midwest. So, and Andy Olson, I mean, there's 20 or 30 of them just here in the Twin Cities metro. So I find that generally once something's been on a site's been around for a while, getting my name as a username is really hard. But I've gotten in early enough on locals that I have Andy Olson as a username. So it's still kind of up and coming. But check it out. Go on there, just poke around. There are other great sites on there, great pages. Babylon Bee has a page there. PragerU, if you're into PragerU, has a page. Scott Adams is a early guy. Scott Adams is the Dilbert comic creator. Scott, he can be kind of an interesting guy to follow. He's gotten a little bit more into kind of politics and stuff, especially going back to 2016 with Trump's run. And Scott's really into persuasion. He teaches people arts of persuasion and how to persuade and how to spot persuasion. And he's got some kind of neater stuff that he does. I am not a paid subscriber on any of those sites, or those pages, but they are on there. Viva Barnes Law is the one page that I pay for. Viva Fry and Robert Barnes are a couple lawyers, and I've been following them on YouTube for quite a while, and really enjoy. Viva Fry is the pseudonym for David Freiheit, who's a lawyer out of Montreal. And then Robert Barnes lives in Las Vegas, and the two of them together have a locals page, and they do some live streaming through YouTube, and they do a lot of stuff that's locals exclusive. The locals exclusive stuff is really neat, and that's what I like about the site is when people start doing the exclusive stuff. A lot of stuff is in front of the paywall. That's why I say just try it, just check it out, go in, see what it's about. I'm really, at this point, I'm not even asking you to subscribe to anybody, much less pay for Echo Zoe, but just try it because it's a neat site. If you do want to try out Echo Zoe, check out the Echo Zoe Ministries page, echozoe.locals.com. We will have a promo code I'm going to do every month, at least through the end of the year and probably well into 2022. We're going to have promo codes up. They will be pinned at the top of the page, so you can just sign up, go in and subscribe. Not when I say subscribe, I mean like you would subscribe to a podcast kind of thing. Not pay, but just go in and like the page, or I don't even remember what the terminology is, but come on to Echo Zoe, and then in front of the paywall, pinned comment at the top will be the current month's promo code. So you can get in and try out Echo Zoe and become part of the community for free. And not going to cost you anything. I think the catch might be you might have to put a credit card in order to use it, but it's not going to charge you for that first month. So I'm hoping that we can grow a community. There's a lot of neat features there. And really for me as a creator on the content side, I'm just trying to build up just a little bit of a community. If I can get 50 people on there, some features start to open up and I get a little bit more, the site becomes more useful on the content creation side. I don't realistically see getting up above 50 is the first tier where things open up. I think the next one is like 500 and I don't realistically see growing that big. Well, Lord willing, that'd be great, but, just get 50 people, opens some things up. And I also just want to introduce people to locals because it's a neat site. There's a lot of value to it. And one of the things is when you're paying for the site, that's where they get their revenue. Both locals and the content creator get their revenue through the subscription model. And so they're not getting revenue through ads. They're not getting revenue by selling your data. They're not data collecting. They're not, that's what I really finally did it for me with Facebook, is just realizing that's always been their business model. And the old saying is, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. And so with locals, you're paying for the product. If you want, like I said, there's a lot of people that go on there and they just use the features that they have in front of different paywalls. And there's several communities that I've poked around on and I like to check in on that put most of their stuff in front of the paywall. And you can get a good, solid experience from them in front of paywalls without having to pay for things. Another neat thing and really a valuable thing that comes out of that structure is that you don't really get the trolls. Because people are not going to pay money in order to go and troll. You go on Twitter, all the rancor that you get on Twitter and Facebook, you just don't quite get that with locals. It's kind of self-policing because people, like I said, people don't want to pay just to go be mean to others. That's what Twitter's for. That's what Facebook's for. So come check us out. If you decide to stay, I did mention last month, I was thinking about doing like a tiered, I was going to tier things where I thought if I got up to the 50, I would drop the subscription price down from $5, which is kind of the typical, what most people charge $5 for their pages. It's not mandatory you charge $5, but that's the typical charge is $5 a month. Minimum is $2. They won't let you charge less than that on locals. And I had been thinking, I think I mentioned last month that if I got to 50 people, I would drop it down to $2 a month. I gave it some more thought and I thought, that's just ridiculous. Why would I wait until I got 50 people before I dropped the price? So I just dropped the price. It's just $2 and that's the least I can get. Locals won't let me charge less than that. Like I said, most of what I plan to put there is going to be in front of the paywall, but in order to get the full rich experience, it's just $2 a month and you're helping Echo Zoe Ministries. I think we probably see about $1.30 of that per month. So, and if I got to 50 people, that would actually, it's not super expensive to run this ministry because it's just, paying for a little bit of bandwidth and web hosting and whatnot. And the 50 people at $1.30 each would cover all of my basic expenses. So I'm not trying to do it for the money, but if we get the 50 people, then that's kind of a fringe benefit, as it would cover most of the expenses of the ministry. So now show notes for this episode, I already put together kind of a bullet pointed list of what I'd like to talk about. So those will be available at echozoe.com/162. So let's get into it. We're going to talk about my testimony today for this October episode. And I suppose the best place to start is just where I come from just in life in general. And, I've mentioned many times over the last 13 years that I live in the Twin Cities Metro in Minneapolis, Minnesota, here in the United States. I've lived in Minnesota my whole life. I was born in southern Minnesota, kind of a medium-sized town I don't know what it was when I was born down there, but it's currently the town is about 27,000 people. So it's not a small town, but it's not a huge town. Lived down there until I was kindergarten age, and my parents, my mom grew up about a half hour away from where I was born. My dad grew up in western Minnesota. They met at a community college. And so after getting married, they moved, they lived out kind of nearby where my dad grew up for a while. And then before I was born, they moved to southern Minnesota. Lived there till I was in, like I said, in kindergarten. And then I was just kind of finishing up kindergarten when we moved up to the Twin Cities Metro. My parents really were just, for the most part, looking for better schools. I was the oldest of two. I've got a younger brother, and they were looking for where can we get a house that's in a neighborhood that we can afford that has really good schools. And so at the time, 30 years ago, almost 40 years ago, actually close to 40 years ago, man, I'm getting old. Where we moved to North Metro was some of the best schools in the Minnesota for public schools. So moved up there, and that's where I did all my schooling from first grade up through graduating high school. Moved around a few different houses and stuff up there, but grew up North Twin Cities Metro. Grew up in both my parents come from families that were evangelical Lutheran. So that's how we were raised, as ELCA, Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, one of the most liberal denominations, one of the most liberal synods of the most liberal denominations out there, mainline denomination. But my parents, I don't know, my parents had good values. I mean, I wouldn't say they were believers as I was growing up. Sorry, Mom, sorry, Dad, if you're listening. I wasn't saved because I was raised in a household where that was important to my family, but it was important to them that we grow up with kind of those typical, cultural Christian values. So, we went to Sunday school every Sunday. As we got into, what is it in ELCA? And I think it's kind of similar to the Catholic Church, but you go through First Communion, usually probably about 6 to 8 years old. You do, it was after I moved, so I must have been 7 or 8 years old when we did First Communion. And then because they're Paedo-Baptists, they do confirmation, and so I went through confirmation in high school. I seem to remember that being about a 2-year process. I think it was 8th and 9th grade was confirmation. That's something that my parents expected, just because that's what they did. And so it was was it a Wednesday night thing for going to confirmation at the Lutheran church that we were a part of at the time. A lot of the people that were in my confirmation were classmates at junior and then into senior high too. But so that's where I was growing up. I did have kind of the very basic of values, some very, very basic values instilled in me growing up, stuff that I very much still respect and I'm grateful for. That if I couldn't be raised in a Christian family, I think the Lord did me very well the way he did it. And as I'm growing up and going through into high school, just kind of typical kid things, going to high school kind of things. I would find myself grabbing my Bible. I would sit down and read it like you and I would read it right now as a believer. I wouldn't sit down and just like read John or read through a book of the Old Testament or a New Testament. I wouldn't read through books at all, but I'd grab it once in a while and just kind of thumb through it and see what I might be able to find. And I remember in high school, I was probably about 16, I would say, thumbing through and having a verse that jumped out at me. And it was a verse that as I was going through in, 10th grade-ish, 10th, 11th grade, started getting through some of that puberty style things where life just seems like it's tougher and you got social structures making things difficult and whatnot. And, you kind of down and out at times. I was never like very much a depressed kind of person, but, just typical adolescent type down and out things once in a while. And the verse that I found that really stuck with me at the time was out of Deuteronomy. It was Deuteronomy 31:8. And this was my ELCA Lutheran Bible that I got through confirmation, I believe. I think that's where I got this Bible. I think I still have it, actually. See it on the shelf over there. So my Good News Bible. I never read the Good News Bible. I don't even really know much about it. It's not the greatest translation. But Deuteronomy 31:8. So the context of this verse, I had to go back years later once I was saved and look, what was the context? Because I didn't even think about context when I found this verse in high school. The context of Deuteronomy 31 is Moses is coming to the end of his life. He's in the land of Moab. The Lord's going to take him up on Mount Nebo and show him the promised land, but he's being told, you're not allowed to go in there. Okay. And he's about to give his farewell speech. Moses knows he's going to die. And he's giving his speech to the Israelites, and he's commissioning Joshua to be the leader that would succeed him. And then once he passed, he knew Joshua was going to lead you into the promised land. And that's where this verse comes. The verse says, the Lord himself will lead you and be with you. He will not fail you or abandon you, so do not lose courage or be afraid. Now, what is typical, I was very typical in that this verse, I kind of claimed this verse. I love this verse. This was my verse, like going to go through tough times. I like this verse. The Lord's going to lead me and be with me, that he's not going to fail me. And so I shouldn't be afraid. And now I know better now, been saved for over 20 years, 2 decades. I know better now that contextually that verse was not written for me. There are other verses that say similar things that were contextually would be more of fair for somebody to latch onto as a promise of God. This one's not really directly good for that kind of thing, but of course, what we can get out of it is that God was faithful, that he said this to the Israelites, he said this to Joshua, said this through Moses, and he kept his promise. So that we can use. But this whole thing was a kind of part of the process. As I look back later on after being saved, I can see in hindsight, I can see the Lord laying the groundwork for eventually saving me, for bringing me into his family and to growing me eventually. And this is one of those things I look back and I think a lot of what I went through growing up, good and bad, and I would say mostly on the good, but good and bad, most of what I went through, I definitely see the hand of God in it all. I see that he was laying the groundwork, knowing that I was his and that he was going to call me eventually. And he was just laying things down so that they would be there when the time was right. Another incident that happened that I look back on pre-salvation and kind of seeing the tug of the Lord on was I can't remember if it was my first year or second year of college. I went to North Dakota State, which is in Fargo, North Dakota, and which is about a 4-hour drive, 3.5 to 4 hour drive from where my parents still live to this day. And so I didn't go home a lot. I think that first year I probably went home more so than the rest of my college time. But I'd gone home, and I don't remember. It might have been Christmas break that I was coming back from, or it might have just been it was a winter trip home, and I was on my back way. I'd been home, and now I'm going back to college. The roads are rough, and winter roads. If you're familiar with the upper Midwest, especially as you get closer to North Dakota and the Dakotas, they can get kind of bad. I had on a previous trip home encountered also some similar type roads, and it's all blending together here. Maybe I'm thinking of a different story, but anyway, I was not that far from Fargo. I was probably 15, 20 miles east of Fargo Moorhead, and hit a spot where the roads were especially icy. And there was a car, it was a pickup truck, like an S10 type pickup truck that was maybe a quarter mile ahead of me on the freeway, half mile tops. I mean, it was a safe distance ahead of me, but it was not, so far I couldn't see it. And I saw this guy hit some icy patch on the freeway, and his pickup started to fishtail. And then all of a sudden he started to lose control. He went off to the right side. He hit the snowbank on the side of the freeway, and then he rolled. And all this happened right in front of me. And so I had a friend that went to college with me, but he was a friend from high school as well. We didn't really know each other that well in high school, but we knew each other well enough that, hey, we're from the same hometown. And he used to ride home with me, and he didn't have a car. He'd ride home and back with me. And he was with me that trip. And this pickup flipped over. So we, immediately, I'm just terrified. I'm wondering, is this guy okay? So as best and safely as I could, I pulled over and went to check it out, make sure he was okay. He climbed out of the driver's side window. He was fine, unhurt. His pickup is upside down, but he's fine. He's completely fine. And but then I'm standing there, and I almost didn't even think about the severity of what happened next. But as we're sitting there talking, somebody else had pulled over also, kind of wondering is everybody okay? And a car came careening by, also lost control, and slid past me, probably going at that point going close to 50 miles an hour as it's sliding out of control right past me, missed me by less than a foot. And when it actually happened, it was just like, oh, car went by. And it wasn't until later that I realized just how serious that was, that I was inches away from, it would have killed me. It would have completely, I would have died that day. Had I been a foot over, if I'd been standing 1 foot in another direction, or that car slid 1 foot closer to me, I would not be with us today. So, but what I got out of that experience was I came out of it, and the Lord had always given me an incredible peace about that. And that even though at the time I wasn't even saved yet, but I got this peace that, going back to this verse that I kind of claimed out of context. And like I said, there are plenty of other verses that say similar things that are not out of context, that would be a valid promise, but that the Lord keeps his people. I never really had a strong fear of death, because I kind of figured, life is, I realize it more now than ever, but life is short. But even at, I was probably 19, 20 years old at the time, just realizing that it's short, and I'm not going to be here that long. But when I go, and the Lord, it'll be on the Lord's timing. So that was something that, again, that kind of kept with me early, but pre-salvation. And So I was saved in college. I was still a student up at North Dakota State University in Fargo. It was my third year. Now, my college is just a little bit atypical, just a tiny bit atypical in that I went into architecture, which I've talked about in the past, but my degree's in architecture. Architecture is a professional degree. And so normally, being a professional degree, most schools offer architecture as a master's program. So you go through undergrad and then you get a master's, you go on and get a master's degree. North Dakota State, I think these days they added a couple credits. And so it is a master's program now, I believe. And I think it's not much different than what I went through, but for an extra few credits. But my degree was not a master's, but it was a professional bachelor's degree. And what made that different than a typical bachelor's degree was that it required an extra year of school. So I did 5 years of school, but it was 5 years and I graduated on time. It wasn't 4 years and I took 5 to get through. It was a 5-year program. So because of that, and then also I kind of got ahead of myself a little bit at the beginning as far as credits go. I was technically a sophomore after my first semester of school, after finishing my first semester. So it's all muddy, to talk about freshman, sophomore, junior, senior we never really talked like that when I was in school because it was a 5-year thing. It was just more like first year, second year, all the way up to 5th year. I was saved at the end of my 3rd year. So school had ended. And I remember it was quite a change for me because in grade school, high school, the school year always ended first week of June. But then I get to college and we were always on a semester system. It wasn't a quarter system that some colleges still have, but it was never that kind of system. It was always a semester system. And so we'd always start last week in August and we would finish first week in May. And I was saved about a week. I don't know the exact date. I didn't think to write it down at the time. I didn't think to look. It wasn't like graduation or getting married or your kids being born or something where I thought, this is a day I should know for the rest of my life. And now I wish I did. I've always kind of wished that I'd remembered the exact date. But it was May 1999. And when I go back and look at the May 1999 calendar, I put it at about the 22nd of May, which was a Saturday. And what happened was I had finished school. I was living alone that year in a 1-bedroom apartment that I'd gotten in college. It was an old house, an old house that had been remodeled and sort of. It was in rough shape, but they turned this one house into 5 apartments. And I was in an upstairs apartment, little 1-bedroom. It was a very small 1-bedroom apartment. I had a friend that was down in the basement. I'm still friends with this guy to this day. He was several years older than me. I want to say 4, 5, 6 years older than me. So he had graduated. I think my freshman year was his senior year. He was a civil engineering. He had gone for civil engineering, and he was living in the basement. This was like not a 1-bedroom apartment. He lived in a 1-room apartment. It was kind of a bedroom, living room, kitchen, all in one, and then with a bathroom. And he was a believer, and he was a neat guy. He's still a neat guy. He lives in Colorado now, and I actually just saw him earlier this summer. He came through. His wife's parents, his wife's dad died, I think before they got married, but his wife's mom lives in just the next town over from where my parents live. So even though he lives in Colorado, he comes through town every so often as they go visit his mother-in-law. He's a believer. And it turned out, I find out after I'd been saved that he'd been praying for me quite a bit. And he'd pray for a lot of people. He was very much very, very extroverted. He was a very social guy, kind of guy that would, I'm kind of borderline extrovert, introvert. I'm like right on the line between the two. I can have enjoyment being with other people, but I can be content by myself as well. So, I kind of break the mold between introvert versus extrovert. Where I'm more on the introverted side is I tend to value having a few really close, strong friendships versus having lots of, not very strong friendships or very deep friendships. My friend Tom is kind of more of that latter. He's very extroverted, but is just more inclined to have lots and lots of friends, and always praying for people. He was in what were those organizations in college? Some of those college organizations. He was at Intervarsity Christian Fellowship. I had several friends that I ended up being friends with in college after I was saved that were in these groups. I was never part of any of them, but what happened was, so I'm home. It's the weekend, like a full week before Memorial Day weekend. I'm back up and just kind of up for the weekend. I don't even remember why I was back, but looking back, it's all providential that the Lord would bring me back up there for a weekend. My friend had another friend, someone who was old enough to be, it's in my parents' generation, old enough to be our dads, but a guy that had a jewelry store over in Moorhead, and another believer. And I don't know how Tom had discovered, well, they're both named Tom actually, how I don't know how they met, but he got his hands on some of these tape sets from Tom the Jeweler, and the tape sets were recorded by Chuck Missler. And if you're not familiar with Chuck, now the late Chuck is had a ministry. He's not with us anymore. Chuck Missler died in I would say May of 2018. So it's been about 3 years ago he died. But older guy, ministry that for many, many years was out of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Very much a eschatology-driven ministry. Very much pre-millennial, pre-trib. He's talked many, many times about his friendship with Hal Lindsey, if that gives you some indication. If you're not familiar with Chuck Missler, you almost certainly know who Hal Lindsey is. Similar theology, very similar eschatology. So my friend Tom, who lived downstairs from me, got from his friend Tom a couple of these tape sets from Chuck Missler. He used to call them briefing packs. They were usually 2 tape sets where each tape, were cassette tapes. That dates me a bit, but these tapes about all kinds of different subjects, but usually they would tie back to eschatology. And this particular one Tom had gotten, and he gave to me as I was home, or back up in Fargo that weekend, was called The New World Order. And I thought, wow, okay, he's like, you got to listen to this. So I took it. It was another one too. I don't remember what the other tape set was, but the one that really grabbed me was New World Order. And it was an interview with somebody, I can't remember who it was, but as they were going through a lot of kind of conspiracy theory type stuff. I mean, if you were to get into some of this stuff these days, these days you'd start thinking, they were right all along, but in those days it would be, kind of a conspiracy theory kind of stuff, but really using verifiable current events and, events from the fairly recent past, the last 10 years before that. And we're talking, this is 99. So talking through the 90s, different things that were kind of working towards a one world system, a world government type system. And the Lord really grabbed me. This is what he used to really wake me up and to show me who I was as a sinner, and to show me that I needed a Savior, and then all that stuff started making sense. That, I went to a very liberal denomination. The ELCA is what I grew up in, but there was enough truth there that I learned. Even simple things like the Ten Commandments would all of a sudden make sense to me as I'm going through this. And what really did it was hearing the case be made that the Lord is gonna come back. And I'd always heard about the second coming, kind of stuff, just through pop culture type references and stuff. But it all of a sudden really like sunk in hard that this isn't just some crazy kooky Christian stuff. That no, he's coming back. He really is. And he's told us what the world's going to be like when he does come back. And the world is kind of setting up. It's kind of looking like it's being set up in that direction. That's what grabbed me. And that's how the Lord woke me up and realized all of a sudden then I realized, okay, he's coming back. And that's not a good thing for me, because all of a sudden I understood my condition. I understood the sin that I was drenched in, that my nature itself was sinful, and that I deserved God's wrath. It all of a sudden made perfect sense to me. And I realized that all of a sudden wow, that's what the cross was about. That's what they keep saying when they say that Jesus saves us, that's what he's saving us from. He's saving us from the wrath that I deserve for my sin. And I realized that all this pop culture type belief in being a good person, you'd get to heaven if you just be a decent person, be better than average, be average, and you'll be fine, And I realized that's not the truth. That's not how the world works. That's how he grabbed me. And I remember it was almost Memorial Day, because I remember a week later I had tickets with some high school friends to go to a concert kind of festival. They used to do this, as far as I know, maybe they still do. There was a Twin Cities radio station called I think it was called The Edge 93X. They kind of went back and forth. They were 93X, and then they were The Edge, and then I think they were 93X again, or I don't remember. But the 90s grunge alternative type music. And some friends were going to a festival. It was a kind of a Friday, I think it was a Friday, Saturday, maybe into Sunday type festival where you'd go stay at a campground. There, the festival itself wasn't at a campground, but there was a campground associated with where the festival was. So people would camp there, and then they'd have buses that would go to the festival. And I remember going to that, and it was really not. I was just freshly saved, and I went there, and it was not the kind of place that a new Christian would. I certainly would. I'd never been back because I've been saved since then, but it was not that kind of. It was a lot of like living for the world kind of activities going on there. And even then, being freshly saved, I came out of it and realized this is really dark. It was really dark. But and that's partly how I remember when it happened, because like I said, I can't remember the exact date. I can't remember, and it was around May 22nd, because the 29th, 30th, 31st of 1999 would have been Memorial Day weekend, and yeah, that would make sense. So it wouldn't have been Friday, Saturday, Sunday. It would have been Saturday, Sunday, Monday, because it was Memorial Day weekend. But anyway, so then the Lord shook me. The Holy Spirit shook me. All of a sudden, his word made sense to me. He testified, and he'd been testifying to me for years in different ways. And I look back, and I'm just, even now, it's, that was 99, and it's 2021 now, and I'm still just utterly amazed at how the Lord would kind of lay a foundation, that he would do things on his timing, but everything was done perfectly. One thing I remember, I grew up, like I said, my parents were churchgoers, but they were like cultural Christians. Like I said, they both were, I think coincidentally, they met at a technical college. They just coincidentally were both ELCA Lutherans. So both sides, my grandparents were ELCA Lutheran. And I remember one of those, that summer, I think that summer was after third year. I think I'd stayed, I know I spent, so I had 4 summers, being 5 years in school, I had 4 summers between the school years. And there was one year that I stayed in Fargo, and I ended up working for the city that summer instead of coming home. And I think that might have been that summer. No, it wasn't. It was the following summer that I stayed in Fargo. No, because I remember that summer I worked with my mom, and we worked with a company that would go into grocery stores, and they called it merchandising. And we would be tasked with going in and making sure that specific groups of shelves were laid out exactly to a plan. And somebody would plan out, the shelves are, 4 feet wide, and there's 3 shelves wide, and there, it might be, you're looking at like the soup section or something. So they would have a drawing that would have every can and like how many facings wide, and every inch of that shelf would be planned out for how it would be. And so we were with a company that would go in and make sure that I'd have a section, and I'd go in and make sure that it was lined up. And I had 3 different stores I was assigned to, so I'd work 3 days a week and go in and make sure that everything was laid out right and whatnot. But so it was an interesting summer, because all of a sudden it was very much a grunt work kind of job, but I had a different outlook on it. The Lord had just saved me. And so I was so utterly appreciative of so much. I had so much gratitude in my heart for everything, and clearly was a different person. But another thing that was interesting was coming home. I recall, my dad was still is self-employed, and still has a home office down in the basement. I remember going down and sitting across the desk with my dad and just talking and sharing my newfound faith with him. And one of the first times that I ever had the chance to share the gospel was sharing with my dad what the Lord had just done to me. And I remember at the time, he was very quiet and just kind of looked at me. He listened, lovingly listened, but I think he had this look on his face like he thought I joined a cult. And I think there was, to some degree, some interest in the story, but I think there was also some worry. I think he was kind of worried that, what has my son gotten into? Now, with time, he would realize that it was genuine, that the Lord had saved me. And he had also would see that, no, it wasn't a cult, because I'm going to normal churches now, hanging around with normal people, not locked into some weird cult group. But that was an interesting experience, and I'm so thankful also for that the first time I'd ever get the chance to share the gospel would be with my father, who I would learn later would leave me some indication that he was extremely grateful for what the Lord did for me, and that it through me, I think he woke up my family to what faith really is. And so still some struggles. I think, we all know what it means to be saved, that it doesn't mean that we're perfect by any stretch at all. The Lord continues to work in us and sanctify us and whatnot. And the other thing that was really big was I just love looking back at how much I devoured my Bible. I remember reading through every chance I get. I would sit down and just read my Bible. That's what I spent my free time with. All of a sudden, the TV was turned off, and I had a Bible in my hand as I would go through and I remember reading through. I read that whole Bible. It wasn't a year. I know people talk about reading the Bible in a year. It did not take that long for me to get through. It took a while. It took months to get through everything, but I just devoured that thing. Now, Chuck Missler was a guy who because he was instrumental in my initial salvation and the Lord showing me who he was and who I was, I really loved his stuff early on. He had a lot of tape. He called them tape sets, briefing packs. He had verse by verse stuff too. When I was saved, that was kind of when MP3s were just really getting started as a format for things. And so I would grab both tape sets, but then also I'd try to get my hands on, a lot of times it would just be a CD with MP3s burned on it. So you could get, far more than an hour. You could get many, many hours on a CD through MP3 format. But I went through a lot of his stuff. And one thing, as I grew, my theology matured and I grew out of Chuck Missler. But one thing I look fondly back on from my days of following his materials was he had a lot of stuff that was verse by verse. Now, the theology actually wasn't terrible. It wasn't very deep in a lot of ways, but it wasn't horrible theology. It was Arminian. It was premillennial. It was, or pre-trib, kind of Hal Lindsey type stuff. But I am so thankful to the Lord for saving me through one of his things, because for the first 5-6 years that I was saved, he was my go-to. He was the guy that I listened to, besides going to church and listening to a live pastor preach every Sunday. If on my free time, if I was listening to Christian materials, a lot of times it was Chuck Missler stuff, and it was that verse by verse stuff. I'm forever grateful for that. It ended up guiding me into where I eventually would get into churches that were preaching expositorily, verse by verse. Took a few years before we got to that point, but ironically, even though our current church isn't so far from Chuck Missler, we're definitely different. But ironically, we found that church through Chuck Missler, because he came to town, Twin Cities, back in 2002. So I'd been saved for about 3 years. And I had caught through his materials that he was going to be in town. I just happened to look down and see, you're going to be in, and not that far into the future. It was Jan Markell who had brought him into town and was having a little mini conference, as Jan, I know she used to do. I think she maybe still does. And this was one of her very early conferences. Jan is very much a similar mindset to the Missler and Hal Lindsey. I think to this day is very much kind of focused on end time stuff. Now she definitely has gotten very kooky. She used to be much better, but so I learned of her through him coming into the town for the conference. And then through her, she was going to Bob DeWay's church at the time. And Bob DeWay is still a preacher at the church that I go to. And it was after we got married. I was married New Year's Day, 2005. My wife and I got married. She, it was really interesting, was saved about a month before I was. So, but 5 years before we met. So we were saved about the same time. Her story is a little different, but it's always been kind of fun to learn that we were both saved so close together. So anyway, we went to a typical evangelical free church when we were dating. As we were going through, we found one that did some marriage classes. We didn't live near each other. We were about an hour apart, so we'd only see each other on weekends. But we found a church that we could do. It was actually a friend of mine that was going there and told me about their marriage classes. So we kind of got into this church through marriage classes. But then after we were married for a few months, it was probably 6-7 months, she was having a hard time with the preaching at the church because the guy, it was a typical E-free church. It was very, very shallow. But what bothered her was the way he spoke, his inflection. He would inflect on the weirdest syllables of a sentence and just drove her nuts. It's just like, we got to find something else. And I'd been listening to Jan Markell, and she used to rail about terrible churches. And I emailed her and said, well, you talk about the terrible churches. You got any good ones that you could recommend? Because we're kind of going to start looking for another church. And she pointed out one. It actually happens to be where my son does part-time private school. And he has done the church that has a school and a seminary attached to it. We went there, checked it out. Good church. My son goes to school through that church, and they're one of the better seminaries in town. They were a little bit on the, I want to say fundamentalist side. I interviewed Kevin Bowder, who was affiliated with the seminary, or he teaches at the seminary there at the school and stuff. And he identifies himself as a fundamentalist Christian, but a little bit, we saw it as almost legalistic and stuff, because we walked in there kind of as get used to the come as you are type churches. And we go in there and the guys are all wearing white button down shirts and dress pants, and the women are all wearing dresses down to their ankles. And we were out of place. My wife's wearing jeans. I'm wearing jeans and a polo shirt. And nobody said anything to us, but we definitely stuck out like sore thumbs. But so she'd said she'd heard good things about that church. And after that one experience, we decided, it's not really for us. But she said, you can always come to what the time was called Twin City Fellowship. And so we thought, well, we tried the other one. I don't want to go to a church just because the lady on the radio goes to that church. But so we went, checked out one, and then we went to the other, and that's where we ended up. And talked about the history. The church ended up splitting in the end of 2012, and so we're not Twin City Fellowship anymore. But where I am now, I'm still going to church with Bob DeWay after it's been 16 years. So, as a baby Christian, I had a lot to learn. I remember, I went to E-free churches up to that point where I was looking for church, and it was actually another thing. I talk about the providence. My wife being so driven crazy by the preaching style that that's what drove us to a better church, and I was primed for it, having listened to that verse by verse stuff, that by the time I got there and experienced verse by verse preaching, and it was, this is home. And so we've been there ever since. But I didn't know, Chuck Missler was an Arminian, and I never really understood that discussion going through. And that was something that I had to go through, and actually Bob DeWay had kind of helped me with a little bit early on. I remember struggling. What is this all about? And I was a big fan of Greg Kokel, who I interviewed very early on. He was one of my first one of my first half a dozen guests, I think, was Greg Kokel in his about his tactics book. And I used to listen to him all the time. And Greg Greg always identifies as a Calvinist, and he seems a little bit more of your kind of mainline Christian, kind of your E-free type Christian, but he always says he's a Calvinist. And then I was also, at the time, Dave Hunt was still around, and I was listening to Dave Hunt stuff, and he railed against Calvinism. He just despised Calvinism. And that was something I remember asking Bob about, and, kind of starting to figure out that Bob is on the Calvinistic side as far as salvation goes, and soteriologically Calvinistic, and a reformed view of salvation. And that was a growth point, was learning what that was all about. Now, Chuck Missler was pre-millennial, but he's also pre-trib, and I've grown out of that. We've talked many times. My friend Ryan Habana, who's on the board at Echo Zoe here, led me out of pre-trib to the pre-wrath understanding of rapture and end times. Now, I know a lot of you listening are not even necessarily pre-millennial. That I have a lot of amillennial listeners, and that's great. I don't begrudge anybody's varying views, and I'm a pre-millennial, and I hold to it very strongly. But I love that we can. I love the divergence on that non-essential issue. I really do. Now, pre-trib is very popular amongst evangelical and Protestant, and what do we even call each other these days? I know I hate calling myself an evangelical, just the way that word has lost all meaning. And I'm actually really, I've said it before, I really admire Scott. All of a sudden now, after all this talking, I'm an hour into this, and I finally can't think straight. Scott Clark is Orthodox Presbyterian, and he's very jealous as an Orthodox Presbyterian of the term Reformed. And it's not good enough to be Calvinistic in your understanding of salvation. You've got to be thoroughly down the line Presbyterian, or you're not Reformed. And I don't quite agree with that, but I've always admired the tenacity that he'd hold on to the terminology and the definitions, because we let evangelical become ruined. But anyway, pre-wrath is very, very niche. Ryan Habana, who led me to pre-wrath, is obviously pre-wrath. Alan Kirshner is a mutual friend that I've have through Ryan that also is pre-wrath. I've had him on at least once. I think he's been on a couple times with me. And then Kofi Ado Bohan is another guest that, as far as I know, well, that's it. As far as I know, people that I could mention on the podcast that a listener might be familiar with, that's pre-wrath. Everybody else, all you pre-millennial or amillennial, there's a lot more of you than there are us pre-wrathers. So, yeah, I talked about how we found our church by way of Chuck Missler through John Markell to Bob DeWay. Now, what fuels me today? I've got a couple verses here that I put in my notes that I want to talk about. What has kept me going for over 2 decades? And one of them was because, as you know, I really got into logic. I love, especially the fallacies, the informal logic. I just love learning about it. I love reviewing it. I love, I love teaching it. I like to, because, I'm not formally trained in any theology at all. Not formally. I'm not going to go to seminary or Bible college or anything. But I've always felt very, very comfortable in that. I like to share what I learn. That's part of my learning process. And I don't like to think of myself as a teacher per se. That's kind of a weighty thing to say, because, the Lord says that there's a stricter judgment for teachers. But anyway, but part of my learning process, and that's part of what's driven this podcast for 13 years is to just share what I learn, and because there's always going to be, if I'm learning it, there's always going to be somebody else who still hasn't learned it too. And so that's always been kind of my drive within the church, the great universal church, is to share, to help. I want to grow and to help my brothers and sisters in Christ grow as well. So along the lines of the logic, one thing that's driven me is I've always taken to 1 Corinthians 15. I'm going to read 12 to 19, but the passage continues past that. But now, if Christ is proclaimed as raised from the dead, how can some of you say that there's no resurrection of the dead? But if there's no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain and your faith is in vain. We are even found to be misrepresenting God because we testified about God that he raised Christ, whom he did not raise, if it's true that the dead are not raised. For if the dead are not raised, not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then your faith is futile and you are still in your sins. Then those also who have fallen asleep in Christ have perished. If in Christ we have hope in this life only, we are a people to be most pitied. And I've always taken to that since getting into logic because I like the logical progression there. That, as I've said in my logic presentations, as I've tried to share what I've learned in logic, I like that this is Paul throwing down the gauntlet. And really, it's kind of a backdoor way of challenging unbelievers. I like to use it that in that sense too, that go ahead, disprove the resurrection. If you can disprove the resurrection as a historical event that actually happened, you can disprove all of Christianity, as Paul says here. He can't be more clear there. If in Christ we have hope in this life only, we are of all people most to be pitied. Really, if we are putting our faith and our hope in a resurrection that isn't even real, that we should be, it's pitiable. It really is. It's pathetic. It really would be. But I have always loved that because of the logical progression and because we know that Christ actually was resurrected. And we know that's the truth. Another passage that, because I went through that early period and having a new believer zeal, I really had a new believer zeal back in 99 and into 2000. Devouring the Bible, as I mentioned, loving reading, listening to verse by verse Bible teachings. And, as I just said about what my own thoughts on kind of teaching in that sharing what I've learned kind of thing. Honestly, I think that's really what Chuck Missler was about. That was it. His ministry was just a similar kind of thing. A guy who really enjoyed learning the Bible in his own way. And a lot of his stuff was really to share that, to teach it to others. But, so in that regard, another verse that's driven me is to not lose sight of that early believer's zeal. And that was Revelation 2, 1-7. To the angel of the church in Ephesus write, the words of him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, who walks among the 7 golden lampstands. I know your works, your toil and your patient endurance, and how you cannot bear those who are evil, but have tested those who call themselves apostles and are not, and found them to be false. I know that you are enduring patiently and bearing up for my name's sake, and you have not grown weary. But I have this against you, that you have abandoned the love you had at first. Remember, therefore, from where you have fallen, repent and do the works that you did at first. If not, I will come to you and remove your lampstand from its place, unless you repent. Yet this you have, you hate the works of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To the one who conquers, I will grant to eat of the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. It sticks with me to try to hold on in any way I can to that early new believer zeal, that love I had at first, the Lord, the one who saved me. So that's it. That's my testimony. That's my story anyway. That's where I come from, how I was saved. lot more than I know. I've mentioned it, sprinkled it out through 161 other episodes, but in its own way. But kept falling behind on episodes, so part of thinking of doing this one is it hopefully will. I have an idea who I'd like to ask to come do an episode with me for November, and doing it this way, I feel like I can. I'm not going to edit this. I'm just going to hit stop. I'll clean up the very beginning and the very end, so there isn't a bunch of pause. But it's just going to go up as it is. So this episode will be a lot less work than normal for me. I normally will put a good half a day into an episode after I've recorded it and am putting it together. So hopefully this will give me a chance to start to catch up. I know I haven't talked to them yet, but December has typically been Fred Butler and Andrew Rappaport. Andrew, I'm sure you're listening for sure. Of the two of you, I'm guessing Fred does too, but I'll be calling or emailing soon, and hoping to get on your schedule for December episode. But for November, still got to find a guest and a topic. And I've got an idea, but I didn't want with kind of getting over the Rona. I hate the term COVID. That's why I'm not calling it that. The politically correct term that the Chinese asked to be used because they didn't like being identified with the virus they created. But yeah, so I call it the Rona, the COOF, whatever. Coronavirus. China-originated viral infectious disease, whatever it might be. But so that's all. But that wraps up episode 162. Thanks for listening to Echo Zoe Radio. Show notes are going to be at echozoe.com/162. And so I had a bullet pointed list. I think I'm just gonna copy that right into WordPress and post my bullet points, my little outline, my guide will be up there. I'll have a few verses that I threw out will be there as well. Don't forget to check out Echo Zoe Ministries on Locals. Please, echozoe.locals.com. That's LOCALS.com. If you like it, and I hope you do, I hope you can join us and start to build a community right now. I'm going to be honest with you. The reason why I'm talking about this, I have one person besides myself. Well, there's two, but one of them is a Locals tech support person. So I really have one person who's signed up on my Locals, and I would like to get that up above 50. I see other Locals communities. I love it's free, and free like free speech. Free as in speech. It's really a neat community place, and they were started by political conservatives, so we know we're not going to get canceled, and their platform rules just are don't break the law. So they're not coming after you if you say something they don't like. I mean, I haven't talked about the founder, but the founder is somebody who I would have serious disagreements on at least one issue, but I'll leave that for you to kind of poke around and figure out who founded Locals and why would I have disagreements with him. I would love to have dinner with a guy, actually, and I think we would have great, respectful, wonderful conversation, but I disagree with one big thing, and I think he would understand and he'd be okay with that, and I think we would still have a respectful, cordial, friendly conversation. But check it out, LOCALS.com and echozoe.locals.com, and check out please, not just Echo Zoe, check out all of the different communities over there, because there's a bunch of really good ones. I like vivabarneslaw.locals.com, and that's where I poke around day to day. Lots of neat stuff there, but that's the episode, and so there we are. Lord willing, I'll be back next month with the November episode of Echo Zoe Radio. And like I like to do every October, in keeping with the celebration of the Reformation on the last day of the month, Halloween, also Reformation Day, I will close the show with the Reformation Polka.
When I was just a younger man, I studied canon law. Though earth was a challenge, 'twas just to please my paw. Then came a storm, the lightning struck, I called upon Satan. I shaved my head, I took my vows, an Augustinian. Papal bulls, indulgences, and transubstantiation. Speak your mind against them and face excommunication. Nail your theses to the door, let's start a reformation. The papal bulls, indulgences, and transubstantiation. When Tetzel came near Wittenberg, St. Peter's prophet's sword, so I wrote a little message for the All Saints Bulletin Board. You cannot purchase merit, for we're justified by grace. Here's 95 more reasons, Brother Tetzel, in your face. O papal bulls, indulgences, and transubstantiation. Speak your mind against them and face excommunication. Nail your theses to the door, let's start a reformation. The papal bulls, indulgences, and transubstantiation. They loved my tracks, adored my wit, all were exemplar. The Pope, however, hauled me up before the Emperor. Are these your books? Do you recant? King Charles did demand. I will not change my diet, sir, God help me, here I stand. Papal bulls, indulgences, and transubstantiation. Speak your mind against them and face excommunication. Nail your theses to the door, let's start a reformation. The papal bulls, indulgences, and transubstantiation. Duke Frederick took the wise approach, responding to my words. Knighting George is hostage in the kingdom of the birds. Use Brother Martin's model if the languages you seek. Stay locked inside a castle with your Hebrew and your Greek. O papal bulls, indulgences, and transubstantiation. Speak your mind against them and face excommunication. Nail your theses to the door, let's start a reformation. The papal bulls, indulgences, and transubstantiation. Now let's raise our steins and concord books together in this place, and spread the word that Catholic is spelled with lowercase. The word remains unfettered when the Spirit gets her chance. So come on, Katie, drop your lute and join us in our dance. Papal bulls, indulgences, and transubstantiation. Speak your mind against them and face excommunication. Nail your theses to the door, let's start a reformation. With papal bulls, indulgences, and transubstantiation. Papal bulls, indulgences, and transubstantiation.